Hello, artists, and art appreciators! Today I'm going to be talking about my completely normal hobby where I meticulously recreate 1980s My Little Ponies in Blender, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do it. As you can see, I've made a lot of 3D models at this point, some of which are based off of specific ponies from the 1980s, and some of which are just trying to replicate the style and fit in with those ponies. This all started a few years ago with the Takara My Little Ponies, who are a Japanese version of My Little Pony that blah blah blah. You've probably heard this all before if you've seen my channel. You can go watch that video if you haven't. In short, they're too rare and expensive for me to ever be able to afford, but I use Blender and photos taken by fans and the community, even measurements based off of actual Takaras that some collectors were kind enough to post, so that I could create my own. And as I did this, I actually realized that there weren't that many 3D models of 1980s styles My Little Ponies. People were actually asking around to see if there were any ones online. Now, there's not that much of a dearth of My Little Pony content in general. If you want a My Little Pony, Basic Fun makes reproductions of the 1980s ones. The fan collective HQG1C makes custom designs as well. There are a handful of collectors out there who sell resin, silicone, and 3D printed ponies as well. However, there weren't that many people producing just the 3D models so that people could 3D print them themselves, especially for the 1980s ponies in particular. There are a lot of Generation 4 My Little Ponies, but not so many of the 1980s ones. So I figured, hey, I need practice. I can help fill this niche in the My Little Pony community. I can make some models of ponies and some of the more niche items, like the Pony Friends, which are a bit rarer, or the Little Litters puppies, which are a spin-off line. I also wanted to learn how to replicate the style in order to make unique models that fit in with the authentic ponies, and so here we are. Before I get into the meat of the modeling, I wanted to talk about the design of the 1980s My Little Ponies and how it changed over the 10 years the original run lasted in the United States. You might think that you know what a My Little Pony looks like, but have you scrutinized them from every single angle? I originally put this presentation together as a reference for myself, but I went ahead and edited it to be a bit neater for this video. And since it's a video, I wanted to start with some credit. First of all, the designers of My Little Pony, Bonnie Zackerly, Charles Muchinger, George Densey, Mark Cardabina, Kirk Heineman, Liz Knight, and many, many more. All of these people are in some way credited or worked on the early My Little Ponies, some of them even working on much later My Little Ponies as well. This project, in general, would not be possible without access to multiple archives of many images of the ponies, which I did rely upon for this video. Most prominently, Ponyland Press and My Little Wiki, which are two of the best online catalogs of My Little Ponies with information about them. I put the photo credit overlaid on each image. I also used my own photos where I could, but I just don't have that much of a large My Little Pony collection so that I could reference every single My Little Pony that was ever made. I'm going to be saying the word pose a lot, and I wanted to clarify the meaning. In the My Little Pony community, the pose is just the name for the unique mold of each pony. And although it is called a pose, there are other differences in the visual design besides just the way the pony is standing. The ponies were originally carved by hand in wax, and the face and proportions of each pony vary slightly. They're really not all identical. Hence, which is why I made this entire presentation, to document that. The poses have unofficial names. Usually the name is the first pony to have been released in that pose. Some people call them other things, like they'll call them like walking pose or something like that based on what they're doing. But I'll just be using the names that are on Ponyland Press or My Little Wiki respectively. What does a My Little Pony look like? Well, it's a stylization of a small horse, or a pony, with very soft features, a large head, triangular ears, large chunky hooves, and big, human-like eyes. The original My Little Ponies were made out of vinyl, which made them soft and slightly squishy, and their long hair was rooted in nylon similar to dolls at the time. The symbol on their rear is inspired by the spots on real horses, the Appaloosa horse, most exemplified by the design of the original pony Cotton Candy and the original group of collector ponies in general. Here is a My Little Pony compared to a picture of a horse. Just in case you were curious about the differences in anatomy, this is the best I could come up with. The first pony pose is actually sort of two poses. It's called the collector pose because it's the first pose and therefore the one that collectors collect. But technically there are two versions. One which is called flat foot because its feet are perfectly flat, whereas all other poses have sort of concave sections, as shown here. Flatfoot's hooves were very large, but also very close together, and its big chunky head made it front-heavy and very prone to falling forward. So due to that, they recarved it into the second collector's pose, which has slightly smaller hooves placed farther apart, giving it slightly better balance. I say because of that, but I don't know if we know exactly why it was recarved, but you can tell that it looks slightly different than the flat foot pose. After the massive success in the first year of My Little Pony, the company began releasing ponies in a wide variety of poses. The first two unicorn poses had very, very similar proportions to the collector's pose. Very smooth joins where the leg meets the body, a very wide head. The spiral unicorn horn takes the place of a forelock between the eyes because it's in the same position. You can see that the lifted leg doesn't have the pony sort of elbow, which is the first joint, but it just smoothly blends with the body. Like the unicorns, the first Pegasus pose is quite similar to the collector's pose in proportions, although the back joint is more pronounced on the Firefly pose just because of the position the pony is in. The Firefly pose has a slightly unusual prominent ridge defining its left foot. The wings are quite small and arranged in 3 layers with 3, 3, and 4 feathers. And they're a little bit pointed at the front to kind of give the illusion that, I guess, the wing sort of connects to the shoulder there. So the Firefly and the Bubbles poses are the only ones with legs that actually merge into the body. Because of these, they could not wear the pony shoes or clothes that Hasbro was promoting with the ponies at the time. The Truly pose was the only pony that required a stand and couldn't just stand up on its own. All of these poses were retired pretty early, actually, and not used so much. The Firefly pose is being reproduced nowadays, but I believe the other two are not. As they introduced ponies in new poses, the design settled into a familiar and recognizable style. The ponies' bodies became a little smaller, or the legs a little longer, and the muzzles slightly narrower. The cheek is less harshly pronounced, and the faces, they feel a little bit softer to me, but I'm not sure if that's the right phrasing. It's hard to describe because they definitely look very similar and yet different. I think of the Posy pose as the most representative of how the early My Little Ponies look in general, and I think the later poses match it slightly better than they do the collector pose or the early unicorn poses and the Firefly pose. They just have a little bit of different structure. Meanwhile, one thing that was never defined was how the wings should look. After Firefly, most of the Pegasus poses have this different arrangement of feathers, and the wings are like unstructured, sort of, like a bunch of little pillows on the pony instead of having that point that the Firefly pose goes to. This is not my favorite thing. The gingerbread pose is another pose that I think is widely recognizable in kind of a love it or hate it kind of way. Its proportions are a little bit sort of bulkier and maybe defined looking than the average pony, and its face is very large, feeling unusually short-snouted in comparison to the overall size of its face. Gingerbread also has little sort of lines defining its hooves, kind of like the ones on Firefly, although they're a little bit less distinct. Like Gingerbread, the Fizzy pose has slightly thicker hooves than the rest of the leg, while some poses like Sugarberry have legs that are fairly consistent with, kind of like the earlier Posy pose. You'll also notice more structure to these later ponies. Instead of having a very defined flank, though, many since the beginning have this sort of indent in the middle of the body like Sugarberry. One thing that I'd like to get across is that these aren't just different poses of the same pony. Some of these ponies are slightly bigger or smaller, have shorter necks or bigger hooves. Each one is unique and hand-carved, and often it's difficult to enumerate the tiny differences between heads, expressions, bodies, and so on. These poses help a lot with the expressiveness of each pony and lend themselves to storytelling, with some looking upright and confident or regal, some looking like they're on the move, some looking shy. For many people, this is a major part of the charm of the original My Little Ponies. In year 6, they began releasing ponies with 3D symbols and recarving the poses in order to accommodate those. This provides valuable insight as to how the designer updated these poses for sort of the later style. One pony of note is that Swirly Whirly is in the collector's pose technically, but has a sort of smaller, more upright head and a thinner body than the original collector's pose, which suggests that this was changed intentionally to match the style of some later ponies, as opposed to them just slapping an ice cream cone on her side. The two Pegasi recarved in year 6 both had their wings recarved, although other features of the pony are very similar. The recarved wings not only don't match each other, but they don't match the style of any of the original wings. Peppermint Crunch has these high-set, somewhat flat wings with a less pointed tip, while Princess Pristina has small wings with a tip and very bulbous feathers. I find these stylization differences some of the strangest among all of the ponies, and my assumption is that this must have just been the work of multiple designers, but we don't really know. Perhaps it was designers who didn't work on the original Pegasus poses, bringing their own influence, or maybe the designer's intentions just changed over time. Or they were just having some sort of off day in the case of Princess Pristina, because, woof. My favorite wing design, by the way, is Peppermint Crunch, but I still consider the Firefly pose wing the most iconic and representative of G1 design, because I feel like it feels a little bit more finished than other wing designs. The Year 7 carousel poses aren't as obviously different, seeing as they have all those decorations that draw the eye away, but they do have some slight differences. Interestingly, this year also featured the first, and I think only time, that Hasbro removed a species feature from the ponies when they removed the horn from the powder poses to make 4 of the Dance and Prance ponies Earth ponies. The Dance and Prances have complex mechanisms in their bodies, which is seemingly why they all use the same pose. All other pony poses represent a single species. They never added or removed horns or wings from poses to change their species. Although the original version of this presentation only covered the standard 3 species, Earth, Unicorn, and Pegasus, I added in the other unique adult-sized pony species such as the sea ponies because they do represent how 80s MLP did different aspects of stylization. There were only 2 sea pony head poses and a single body, which was upright. Fun fact, because it was meant to be a bath toy and floated. Also a fun fact, actual seahorses' pectoral fins, which are the equivalent of fish arms, are actually up on their head next to their eye, not on their side. But it definitely provides an example of how My Little Pony stylized seahorses, so that's fun. Flutter ponies are also a diversion from the standard My Little Pony, being a different species of fairy-like pony with unique iridescent wings. They have a mechanism, I guess. It's really just something that bends the plastic wings so that the wings can flutter when you press a little button. These have small snouts and proportionally longer and thinner legs and are smaller than standard ponies. There is a slight variance between some of the Flutter pony molds. Flutter ponies are a good reminder that My Little Pony collectors can identify the most minute differences between 2 near identical molds. So if you're trying to replicate something, you just accept that it will never be perfectly like the original. The My Little Pony Friends were a release of My Little Ponies who were not ponies, but are other animals stylized just like them. I confess that they are probably my favorites out of all of the My Little Ponies because I am not actually a horse girl. I don't have a specific fondness for real horses. I love many animals though, and my favorite large mammal is a giraffe. So I love Creamsicle, the giraffe. These were fairly inconsistent in stylization, and there aren't that many examples, but I do have a whole separate presentation about Hasbro-adjacent non-pony animal figures. It has 25 slides, so we just don't have time to cover that here. Up until year 5, nearly every My Little Pony was explicitly a girl, both on the back cards, which showed their backstory, and in the TV show. Note that I say My Little Pony because there were male pony friends, like Edgar the Elephant. Year 5 introduced the Big Brother ponies, who were larger than the normal ponies and had feathering around their feet. That's just what you call the fur around the base of a Clydesdale horse's feet. It is not gendered in real life, but it is in My Little Pony. Also, in case you're wondering, as I was, real horses don't seem to actually display much size-based sexual dimorphism like other species, but I guess this indicates that maybe they're just different breeds of horse, and that's why the big brother ponies are all so big. Although nothing explains the dimorphism and the activities of the big brother ponies, which are based around trains, cars, boats, and so on. You know, boy things. The year 7 Sweetheart Sisters were a big departure from the standard size of pony, being a little bit more horse-like overall, but simplified in a lot of other ways. The actual toys are only slightly bigger than the equivalent pony toys, which makes them kind of gangly looking and quite skinny. They have thinner legs, necks, and smaller heads compared to their body overall. I personally think that the lack of definition in their long, thin legs makes them look a little unusual, like they should just be a little more detailed. As Generation 1 entered its twilight years, there were more and more changes with how they released ponies and poses. They began releasing fewer new poses, and they had enough in their catalog that every set of ponies had a unique pose. Originally, the sets had 2 unicorns, 2 pegasi, 2 earth, or 1 unicorn, 1 pegasi, and the rest earth ponies. Later on, the set size would be reduced to 4 instead of 6 ponies. The year 8 bride pose sits somewhere between the Sweetheart Sisters and standard pony size and stylization. Although the bride has a thin body, tall neck, and legs, her head is still quite large, and her legs end in a little bit chunkier hooves. Her ears are also very large, and her eyes are closer to standard pony size. Note that one of the back hooves actually has a blunt tip to help her balance a little bit better. There are a couple of other unique and single-use poses near the end of Generation 1 made for specific gimmicks. The Sweet Steps ballerinas were some of the only articulated ponies, and their body was cleverly designed so that the body looked like a leotard and the articulated legs were color of the normal body, so it kind of disguised the fact there was a joint there. The proportions and face matched the bride pony most because the bride pony's head was also reused for some of the ballerinas. Another variant pony was the Secret Surprise, built with a compartment in its back and a key. These are much larger than standard ponies and possibly inspired by Keeper's toys. The final standard pose releases were the Bubblefish and Bunny Hop poses, which would only be used a handful of times each. To me, these poses look a little off-model, I guess, to most of the other poses. I believe it's the slightly longer legs and thin bodies, but there's something about the face that I just can't quite pinpoint on these as to why it doesn't quite look My Little Pony-ish. For these later ponies with 3D symbols, the 3D part was a separate piece, which did unfortunately lead to a lot of them getting lost, but at least that meant that they didn't have to do completely separate resculpts per pose. The petite ponies are more like an offshoot of My Little Pony, but they were close enough that I felt like they should be included, so I could just make some notes about them. I have several models I made specifically referencing the petite ponies, including a unicorn pose so that people could have their own petite unicorn, since they actually only made Earth and Pegasus ponies in the original petite pony groups. Since these are meant to be very small, it's important to simplify the details and make everything proportionally chunkier if you're making a model of one, especially the head, and prevent there from being pockets that would make it hard to 3D print if that's what you're going for. Mine don't include the hoof shape on the hoof, which is meant to allow them to snap into a playset, because I would need the technical know-how to make that work. I would have to physically measure one. So if you want to make one specifically to replace them in the playset, make sure you have an original and you can measure it. I'm guessing that a lot of them get lost, so they tend to be a little bit expensive. Up until now, I've been talking about ponies that Hasbro made, and Hasbro is a US-based company, so they're technically all the US ponies. However, around the world, they usually license the brand to other countries, either to make or sell ponies locally. Although some European ponies had a wealth of the Hasbro poses, many other countries may do with just a handful of poses, which they use to make a wide diversity of ponies not found in other countries. The country of production is usually, but not always, listed under the hoof. US-made ponies have Hong Kong under the hoof, as that is where they were made. There are some poses that were used very few times in the United States, like the sitting pose, that were also used in other places, like in Greece. Hasbro itself only matched bodies to different head types a handful of times, like with the sea ponies, the ballerina ponies. But countries with access to fewer molds were able to create unique pony poses by combining the head and body from different poses. The most well-known of these is the quote-unquote South African pose, which is a combination of Firefly's head and Moondancer's body, although there is a variant with Glory's body as well. It seems that South Africa might have only had access to Glory, Moondancer, and Firefly, and combining Firefly's head with Moondancer's body allowed them to have Earth ponies as well. There is one company, a single company as far as I can tell, that tried to emulate Hasbro's style and making their own licensed My Little Pony. And that was Milton Bradley or Brecker. I actually don't know which one made this pose because both companies sold these ponies in Spain in the 1980s. All of the quote-unquote collector ponies that were made and designed in the United States were released in this pose in Spain, as well as several unique ponies with different symbols and unique names and everything that were only produced in Spain. These ponies have small hooves, details like wrinkles on their body, inset eyes which open and close with 3D lashes. Although Hasbro produced baby ponies with these sleepy eyes in the United States, they never sold adults with this type of eye. Due to being a foreign release, these are exceedingly rare in the United States and could go for hundreds of dollars on their own, or even like $1,000 for the rare designs that are unique to Spain. The Piggy ponies are a good illustration of just how similar you can get to a My Little Pony, yet how the small differences make it clear that it's not a My Little Pony designed by the original team. In a sense, these look kind of like they're bootlegs. In fact, a lot of people believed that the Piggy ponies were bootlegs or unlicensed My Little Ponies that were just being sold by some company without the permission of Hasbro, until it was revealed that no, if you look at the mint on card versions of these ponies, it's very clear that they were licensed directly from Hasbro. There's just so many ways that you can make a horse. Anyways, speaking of rare designs, here are the Takaras. The other company with a My Little Pony license who created their own original designs was the Takara Company in Japan, but they did not bother to emulate Hasbro because they were doing their own thing. I'm not going to say much more. Again, there's already a lot on my channel and in my brain about these guys, so you can't get me started on them. I decided to also include a couple of slides specifically about the design philosophy you can observe in Generation 1 in case you're interested in replicating those themes. You don't need to follow these rules at all. In fact, many people like to intentionally break them, especially by making ponies in less common colors. Is this just an excuse to use the data in my 500 G1 pony spreadsheet of all of the United States pony releases? Yes. Although this does include the baby ponies, which I didn't really talk much about. Also, this data was collected by me, so it might vary a little in accuracy in relation to the colors. But just here's some fun facts about the My Little Ponies. Like, for example, the number of hair colors was actually usually just one hair color. Specifically, the unicorns, the early unicorns, had just a little streak of a different color in them. In terms of body colors, we actually have quite a diverse array of body colors. It's not just pink and purple. We've got a lot of yellow ponies, a lot of white ponies, a lot of blue ponies, and then for some reason, like, barely any orange and green ponies. I don't know what Hasbro had against the orange and green ponies, but there was only one pony ever that was truly gray. Gray and white remained the, like, only truly realistic colors, even though the original designer, Bonnie Zachary, actually wanted the My Little Ponies to have realistic colors. Kids like the pastel colors more. While the early symbols were pretty basic, they became far more complex over Generation 1's times, although they never used that many colors and detail. Some had glitter or 3D symbols, although this is really just for the toys and doesn't translate over to the show characters. I think of Generation 1 as having 3 sort of eras within it. The first 3 or 4 years, the releases have pretty straightforward gimmicks. They generally use fewer colors and are a little simpler. They have like the glittery symbols on the original Unicorn, Pegasus, and Rainbow ponies, or the flocking on the So Soft ponies. Quite a few ponies had the glitter symbols or the flocking. These were used over multiple years, and sets would usually just have one little thing like that. My Little Pony peaked around year 7, and from around year 5 to 8, every set has a gimmick, a different gimmick, many with multiple gimmicks. The Sunday Best ponies, which had 3D symbols and were also scented. Some had mechanical gimmicks that weren't even on here because there's just so many gimmicks, and I could only put so many on my little chart and make it readable. The last couple years, there were fewer sets in fewer poses overall, although they did introduce several strong gimmick-specific molds, like the Secret Surprise, the Fancy Mermaid Babies, and modifications to the newer poses, like how the Sweet Talkin' Ponies had open mouths and speakers. And that's my whole analysis section done. I didn't include the stuff about baby ponies because honestly that could be a whole other presentation, but generally speaking they are smaller versions of the adults with proportionally larger heads and shorter legs. They're sort of chibified versions of the adults rather than similar to actual horse foals. You can use these rules that I've listed in this presentation to make your own version of poses or to create replicas of existing poses, and there's nothing stopping you from combining heads and bodies, although the results will vary. I'm not so fond of the South African combo pose, but my reverse firefly twilight pose is kind of nice, even though my firefly is a little damaged and the colors are a little off. I think if they were mint, this would work really well together. Anyways, that's all for me here, and let's go to the sculpting phase to really get into it. But before the sculpting, we have to pick out which pony we're going to replicate. I wanted to do a pose that I hadn't done before, and a pony that I own, and most of the ponies I own are ones that I've already made replica versions of, or that other people have 3D scanned. I try to avoid overlapping my replicas with their scans, just so there's more variety in ponies overall. Personally, I think of my replicas as more like fan art, and I think my own influence comes through a little more on them, especially on the more unique or completely unique designs that I've made. So one of the only non-baby ponies I have in my collection right now that I haven't done is Frilly Flowers. This is a Sweetheart Sister pony, so a little bit of a different proportion to the other ponies. But I am a pretty big fan of these girls. They're kind of controversial within the community, so I hope people don't mind me doing them, but the basic steps to doing a Sweetheart Sister are the same as doing any of the other ponies, but with slightly different proportions. When I'm doing ponies or other designs like Cha-Cha and Cute Saurus, I spend a lot of time looking for reference materials, and I felt like using my own pony was the best way to show you the kind of reference photos I look for. The first thing I do is trace out the body on both sides, front and back. Having a line art version of the photo is just much cleaner to work with for the 3D sculpting and prevents me from getting distracted by things like colors and hair and whatever. I did do a lot of tracing, but it's not necessary to have a perfect angle on everything as long as you get a variety of images. So this Blender guide isn't going to be totally in-depth, but I'll try to include a few shortcuts that I use a lot on screen, but it's not a beginner Blender guide. You'll probably have to have used Blender before to follow some of it. I recommend Joey Carlino's beginner Blender video, and I'll leave some links in the description about Blender tutorials that I recommend. My first stage in Blender is blocking everything out with cubes that I smooth using the subdivision modifier. Because these are technically cubes, they have only a few vertices and are easy to modify and shape around. And I shape the broad strokes of the body this way. Thinking of it like taking out some clay and making simple blob tubes for the body, legs, and head, and then I'll do the details afterwards. Two important tools I use a lot when I'm doing these subdivided cubes are the vertex crease and mean crease, which are up in the corner. These essentially sharpen the convex edges and create deeper creases, and you can get shaping from them as well. It's a little hard to explain. I make the legs in the simpler version of each pose first, and then mirror that over to the other side, and then I modify the leg to the other position. Same thing with the back legs, but widening up the front and lining up with the body as best as possible. You'll notice after I've made the basic body and head shape, I turn the symmetry tool off, and I don't necessarily make the legs perfectly symmetrical either, even though I mirror them. I think this helps in trying to maintain a more handmade feel. It takes a little extra time if you want to try and make everything symmetrical without using the symmetry tool, but it deserves that time and it's worth it, I think, in the end. When I first learned Blender, I was shown how to make something symmetrical and then use an armature to pose it. But I realized over time that that's not always necessary, and it's actually not the best for practicing. You know, getting used to figuring out symmetrical parts of your project, even with the symmetry tool turned off, is really useful and also very important if you're going to be doing physical sculpting as well. Since I like to use Blender as a way to sort of draft physical objects, that's kind of important. For a simple model, mirroring the limbs and arranging them by eyesight is easy enough. Once I have everything in place, I can remesh all the parts together and start sculpting in sculpt mode. I use my mouse and click buttons while referencing my tracings and the photos and the physical toy which I had in front of me at the time. I don't always have a physical item, but I just reference multiple photos on a second screen. If you're wondering whether digital 3D sculpting is harder or easier than working with real materials like clay and so on, I don't really have a good answer. The main issue is that as humans, we have generally two eyes, and when hand sculpting, each eye can see a slightly different angle of the thing. That's what 3D vision is. The computer program is a 3D environment, but is fundamentally on a 2D surface, so our eyes are always just seeing a flat picture of this 3D object. This reduces us to essentially monocular vision, like a prehistoric fish. This can make symmetry a little more time-consuming because you kind of have to move back and forth in a way that you wouldn't have to in sort of the real world. I don't really have any tips during the sculpting phase. While I'm sculpting this pony, I wanted to chat about something else. Originally, I was considering making this a whole separate part of the video, but I've already started editing on the PowerPoint presentation, and I know this video would be so long if I included everything I have to say separately, so I'm overlapping this with the sculpting, because I don't have much to say about that. I feel like a question someone might have upon seeing a video like this is, why? Why sculpt a 1980s My Little Pony based off photographic references? Why did you feel the need to do all this personal research defining the specific qualities of these toys and how they're sculpted? But also, why copy? What's the value in copying? Is there any value in copying? And I could say what I said at the beginning, that honestly this was started as practice, and I do think an answer that copying is good practice is a fine way to see it. But I've been thinking about this a little more for two reasons. One is that I recently rewatched the 2019 My Little Pony television special, Rainbow Road Trip. In it, Rarity, a fashion designer pony, meets a pony named Kerfluffle, who has some of Rarity's designs in her shop. Kerfluffle has added accessories to them like hats and a boa. Rarity tells her, "Why don't you simply display your own work instead of adding to others?" Rarity compliments her work, which gives her confidence, and quite literally helps bring color back into the world. What a fascinatingly interesting statement on art, no? Just the writers of a show derived from a toy line that has had 4 different iterations, 2 previous shows, half a dozen combined movies and specials, proudly announcing the message that adding on to others' work is not a valid way to create art. And I say the writers and not Rarity because this message is reinforced by the magic that literally happens as a result of her telling that to Kerfluffle. And mind you, I'm not saying it's intended as a bad message, but it did make me think, which as we all know, My Little Pony is not supposed to do. The other reason I've been thinking about this is because I recently watched the YouTuber Jazza's video on AI art. It was called I Was Wrong About AI. Full disclosure, I do not normally watch Jazza. I've only really seen that video and vaguely heard of him. It just kept popping up in my recommendeds, like YouTube thought I would really like to watch it, and I did find it interesting. Jazza has a lot of interesting things to say about generative AI, and I quite liked many of his points. To be clear, I absolutely hate AI. I felt like I should say that up front because there's really no beating around the bush. As a biologist, I've watched it spread the worst scientific misinformation and fuel ignorance. As an artist, I've watched lazy and boring people pretend they're doing something impressive by pressing buttons go beep beep. And as a person, I've watched the internet just get absolutely blasted with slop trying to sell you this or that. It's exhausting, and it's becoming more and more difficult to exist on the internet and try and create things at the same time. But one thing that comes up so often in discussions of AI is that it's copying. And I guess I've realized that I don't agree with that, or maybe it's that if AI was that, I don't think those qualities are what makes it bad. Let me explain. If you haven't noticed, hi, this is my YouTube channel where I talk about various toy lines, including My Little Pony, and I love copying things. If you haven't noticed, it's a thing that all of humanity loves and has done all of time throughout history. So when people deride AI as copying and say that's the problem, I sometimes feel a little defensive. Even though I think that morally AI is sort of stealing something, I am reluctant to support legal efforts like copyright, which have historically only propped up large corporations. As it is, it's those same large corporations who are now supporting the use of AI, stepping on the heads of all the artists who created the content that they wanted to use originally. And at the same time, it pisses me off when people commend AI for copying. Since humans also make derivative art, Now those people just say AI is a shortcut to the natural state of artistic inspiration. I mean, AI isn't a shortcut. That's not what that word means. A shortcut implies that you would have gotten to the same place without it. If you skip the peppermint forest and gumdrop mountains by taking the rainbow trail, that's a shortcut in Candyland. You don't take the shortcut off the Candyland board to Gumslop Mountains. Definitionally not a shortcut. AI is not the same as a human copying by eye, or even a human tracing an image. AI is also not the same as printing an image out. It's just a third thing that everyone wants to compare to other things, and it's exhausting. It's not even artificial intelligence. It's a large language model creating generative images based on a database trained on what humans consider art, released to the public as a tool, ultimately so they could get real-world training data. And then they will turn around and put it behind a paywall so Disney can AI generate the next Disney princess or whatever. And then people who thought they were making art with free AI tools won't have anything. No skill to speak of because they never did anything. One of the more depressing things about having a YouTube channel is that the vast majority of brand offers I get aren't just shitty scams, but the worst kind of shitty scam. 3D AI companies trying to get me to shill their products. It's hard for me to believe that a real person would send me, a 3D artist, an email like that and think that I would respond kindly to it. As if I'd want to work with a company that's trying to make my skills obsolete. Although who knows if there's even a real person there. Since Google can generate AI emails, why should I ever believe that someone emailing me is a real person? Especially if I know that they use AI. I guess that's the irony of an AI company trying to connect with people. There's nothing to connect with, or at least I can't believe in my heart that there is. At this point, using AI just taints a product or company for me. It's a sign that they didn't bother, that they didn't even try. Here's the thing that I have to admit. I get jealous when I watch someone just learn a new skill. Sarah Renee Clark did a video recently on learning Blender in 100 hours, and I watched the whole thing because I really loved watching the journey. Even though everyone who is learning wants to skip to the end, when they know everything, it wouldn't be the same if you just knew everything. You don't have the process to get there, and how that changed you and changed your art. It's depressing to think people might not learn because they think that their art isn't worth doing. And it's depressing to think people use AI to try and, quote unquote, pretty up their work and make it look more like everyone else's. I used to feel so self-conscious over drawing cartoons and fan art and ponies and pretty much anything that wasn't trying to be like an oil painting. And yes, I say that because I tried oil painting in high school, and also because Jazza references his own oil painting as an example of the meaningfulness of human-made art. And it's great that that's meaningful to him, really. Thoughts about what art counts as real and legitimate were what kept me from growing as an artist for a long time. As an adult, I picked up pony art again. That led me to 3D modeling and toy design, 3D printing and laser cutting, and a whole bunch of other things that I would not have gotten to if not for the initial step of copying something else. Because I have this YouTube channel, I got a laser cutter, and because I have the laser, I made gifts for my real-life ecological volunteer group. One of them recommended me to the host of an art show, so I'm making an art doll for it, and if I finish and show it, that will be the first time I've brought my art to a real-life event to show it to people. And it will be my first piece of art combining my love of nature and my ecological volunteering and the environment with art dolls. I guess this whole conversation is different depending on whether or not you even consider My Little Ponies art, because people don't think of commercial toys that way. But they exist because of artists. I mean, everything you touch and interact with is the product of some kind of art, the textile industry that makes your clothes, the designers that make a lamp, and even toys. They all exist, and that includes AI-generated images because of the work of artists. I mean, I like to think that the process and the intent defines this art as much as the end result. The context behind loving something so much you create a copy of it just to hold it in your hands. Even when I am copying, maybe it will inevitably have the influence of my art, my quirks and design principles. AI doesn't have that. It has errors, but it doesn't have quirks. They're not the same thing. Sometimes I look back and I realize I've made my vision of something instead of what it really was. And even when I'm trying to copy art, I can't do it perfectly. I had this thought at one point that if there's anything LLMs are stealing, it's the time-honored tradition of artists copying art. But I guess I realize now I don't even think that's true. You can follow this video as a tutorial and use my drawings and make your own and tell me how different it looks to mine and how it looks compared to the original creators. If you're a person, you're a different person with different experiences, skill level, and intent. And that makes you more of an artist than every LLM user on Earth. Anyways, I like copying things, and I hope you found my little tangent here interesting. If you don't know Blender and are interested in learning Blender, and are interested in me making a video tutorial, let me know. I have some ideas for one and began editing it a while ago, and it will also involve copying toys, but much simpler toys, in order to make 3D models, like in this video. Again, Blender is totally free, you just need a computer to use it. It can feel intimidating to start if you're not used to a software like it, so I'm looking for feedback on what people want to see in a Blender tutorial that they haven't seen elsewhere. I would love to facilitate more people learning Blender and learning art in general and feeling more confident in their art. I made my first ever Blender project about 3 years ago. It was this video, December 2022, and this was my first piece of art. I love Blender so much, learning it was probably one of the biggest changes, I guess, to my artistic abilities. I'm not being paid to gas up Blender or anything, I just really love Blender. I'm obviously not a Blender expert by any means, having only learned it for a few years, and I mean, you can look at my art and see it that it started off very rocky. But I hope that having learned it recently will give me a different perspective when introducing others. I also have some bonus edits to the sculpt that I want to include. Since the Sweetheart Sisters are all Earth ponies, I wanted to show how I make the variant pony types. I drew up a little sketch of the Pegasus wings, a unicorn horn, and feathered hooves like the Big Brother ponies. I made a copy of the model I was using, of course, so we can have an example of the normal pose along with the unicorn Pegasus version. The Pegasus wings are made pretty much the same way as the body, using a whole bunch of squares that are smoothed out using subdivisions. Like I said before, I tend to follow the firefly wings as an example, but the wings on G1 My Little Pony are so variable you can kind of go crazy with how you design your wings. Although if you want to match the style closely, usually just use 3-3-4 or 3-4-4 sets of feathers. But I don't blame you if you want to make the wings more realistic or larger. You can do whatever you want. With my Luna and Celestia Alicorn 3D models, I made their wings bigger with 5 rows of feathers instead of 4 on the outside, and I think that still manages to match the G1 style. Also, they're inspired by the bride pose My Little Pony, so although their legs and neck are long like Sweetheart Sisters, their hooves are wider at the bottom, and their eyes are a bit bigger. For the unicorn horn, I have a bit of a cheat method, well, a way to make it easier, at least. But this is actually a Blender add-on. If you didn't know, you can go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons to add unique functions, and this one is called Add Curve Extra Objects in Blender 3.6. It's just called Extra Curve Objects in Blender 5.0. I double-checked. The version I use in this video is 3.6, but I checked the newer version. I make a logarithmic spiral, give it some dimension in the Geometry Bevel tab, and adjust the settings until the spiral looks horn-like. Then I can convert to mesh and smooth things out neatly afterwards. A standard My Little Pony unicorn horn has about 4 full segments on when looking at either side, but I sometimes make them a bit taller if I'm doing a taller pony. The hooves and the hoof fluff is a bit time consuming, and out of all of the additions here, I think they look the worst, specifically on the Sweetheart Sisters, but oh well, this is how I do them generally. I think their legs are just too long and skinny to look good with this level of detail because they're so simplified otherwise, but that's besides the point. I just tried to show how I would add this kind of detail. All of these little lines are curves which have geometry added to them and tapered ends. Eventually I'll combine them with the legs and smooth them to the body. Instead of doing this, you can use the Sculpt tool directly on the legs if you want. That's just less intuitive to me, I guess, because I think of the line method as if I'm taking little bits of clay, rolling them into a little line, and then placing them on the legs. It feels like more like how I'd sculpt in clay, and so it's naturally how I prefer to do it digitally. It's also pretty easy to adjust the bits back and forth and make everything look neat, and I can copy these over to the other legs once I'm done. Yes, I did copy these, even though that's not very asymmetrical of me, but not everything can be perfectly asymmetrical. Sometimes those copy-paste tools come in clutch. Once I finished the Pegasus Unicorn version, I thought it would be fun to show you how you could further customize a pony and even maintain some of the MLP style while you're at it. I made this version with little bat wings who could be a Halloween type pony. I even tried my hand at flutter pony wings, which was not that easy because the original flutter ponies have these weird, bubbly, cloud-like iridescent wings, but I made my best attempt at them and gave them some fun coloration and transparency. I'm not even sure if you could 3D print these, but I guess if you had like a clear resin or something, maybe you could try. Finally, I took some inspiration from the Generation 1 pony friends and modified the ears and the face and added some antlers, a little fluff, and made some sort of caribou thing, deer. This one was probably my favorite out of all of them. I feel like this pony was maybe always meant to be a reindeer. Too bad this wasn't finished until way after Christmas. Before I finish this video, there are 2 routes to finishing this up. If you make a model like this, you might want to render a nice picture of your original character, or even 3D print it. And those processes look different depending on what you want to do. This isn't a full guide on how to do either, but this is how I do it when I'm either 3D printing or rendering. For 3D printing ponies, the process is pretty straightforward. First off, depending on how detailed it is, I might remesh the model to reduce some detail, because I have a tendency to make overly detailed models, especially if Dyne-Topo was turned on. Then I cut off the pony's head with a quick Boolean difference modifier, and a flat plane. Very simple. I separate the head and body and add connectors, which are just cylinders, that I add to the neck, and then I make a hollow cylinder on the other side. I might also make the inside of the body and head hollow using some simple shapes in order to reduce the amount of material and also make hairing it possible, similar to a traditional pony. And then I can use a cylinder to also cut a hole for the tail. For the hair, ideally you need at least 1 row of holes so you could stick some hair in and then glue it in. I make a cylinder and then use the array tool to copy it a bunch of times in a row. Then I make a curve and I shape it to the neck where I want all the holes to be. Then I use the modifier curve and click on the curve, and then voila, all of the cylinders should arrange themselves to the curve. I make the holes at least big enough to maneuver a larger needle. That does mean they're a little more obtrusive, because obviously this probably isn't going to be printed in flexible plastic, but there would be no point of making them if they were too small to use. After making these adjustments, I export each part as a separate STL file. I test all my files in the 3D printing program Cura, which my local library uses. I've actually used a different program called Chitubox for printing files on my own 3D printer because it's a resin printer instead of a filament printer. But in Cura, I can ensure that the files import and slice properly and check that there aren't any error messages. If I've sculpted them at a small size, which I usually do because I'm not paying attention, I might resize the pony and then re-export it. And then once you've tested it, you can print your pony or send it off to be printed elsewhere. For 3D rendering example ponies, I need to add the eye symbol and hair all in Blender. Now, there are multiple ways to do this, but I use kind of an unorthodox way myself. For the eyes and symbol, anything on the body, I just use a plane, and Blender's built-in color tools, black outline, white sclera, blue eyes. I basically make the eye a little flat sticker, and then I put it on the face using the face project tool. I subdivide it to smooth it out a bit, and I use the modifier shrink wrap to stick it close to the face. Since this eye had eyeliner, I did make the lashes on a separate plane that I just put on top of the first one. Usually I make all the eyelashes with the eye. There are definitely ways to do this that aren't whatever I'm doing, and I wouldn't be surprised if this method horrifies some experienced 3D artists. But retopologizing everything in order to add textures to it is very time consuming and also really not worth it if you're going to use it also as a 3D print, because then you just have to do double the work, and also making it perfect while also retopologizing it would be annoying. And also this way makes it super easy to change the colors, like the eye colors and everything, without going into a separate texture file. Also, the original My Little Ponies had eyes and symbols that were stamped or painted on using stencils, so this feels very accurate. I even sometimes add a little bit of depth using the solidify tool so the symbols have a little bit of dimension, which would be accurate to the original ponies. For the cheeks, I use the same stamp method with the plane and make a circle on the cheek, but I actually do use an image here. I just attach a transparent image, I make it transparent, and then I make the little blush spot. Because it is so transparent at the edges, you wouldn't know that it's just a stamp. The hair is also a pretty simple shortcut to doing hair in Blender. I make a plane and then extrude it under the surface of the neck of the pony and also near the tail, following the line of where I want the hair to be. If you're using a model with hair holes, you can follow those. Note that I don't really worry about accuracy in hair placement when I'm making these. As in, I don't worry about the hair actually coming out of those hair holes, which means some of my hair tends to be clipping through the pony's head. There are ways to adjust exactly where the hair comes from using mask textures, but I'm not confident enough in them to give precise guidance in this video. I simply click on my hair plane thing, UV unwrap it, and then add hair curves. And then I go into sculpt mode and begin adding the hair. I use Asset Browser to add curves and a bit of noise to the texture. I spend a while fiddling with the settings to make it look right. Add shine and metallic for the hair color. Usually I make the hair tail and sometimes the forelock out of separate hair curves. If I have multiple colors of hair, I might just make them separate curve objects, although sometimes I can also set up geometry nodes to texture paint hair colors. That's a little complicated, and there is a Joey Carlino tutorial that I follow for it. It will be linked in the description. I set up a plane behind the pony to give it a little background, and then sometimes I just make the background transparent by checking the transparent box under the Render Film tab. Then I add my light sources and I modify them however. I learned this method of making a background from the Brand Sculpts tutorial. For all of this, I use the default shaders, basic colors, and so on in Blender. I have my color management set to standard instead of the default filmic setting, and I just render in Eevee. If you want a more realistic render, I suggest looking up tutorials on rendering plastic and rendering in engines other than Eevee. It's not really my area. I'm fine with my renderings looking as they do, and it's something you'll want to look into as you learn more about Blender. If you're kind of a beginner, then just use the default settings. So that's how I make all my Little Pony models from scratch, my 3D printing method, and my rendering tips, I guess. I hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. Again, if you have any questions, I am planning on making a short intro to Blender beginner video in the future, so feel free to let me know if there's something you think I should include there. Thank you to my Ko-fi supporters, Yasella, Luca, Gabby Rose, and Serendipity. Consider leaving a like and a comment to let YouTube know you liked the video, and if you really like me, consider joining my Ko-fi supporters over on there to get access to a whole bunch of my 3D models of ponies. And some other stuff. Okay, bye!